this little jacket that I wear, which unfortunately over the long winter has become a little bit snug. A couple things about it actually. It is a little bit snug because at this point it is, what year is it? 15? It is 2 years old because it was my wedding Spencer. The very exciting thing in this time period about wedding clothes was only for the very rich and high were wedding clothes a specific one-time only garment. In my era, your wedding clothes would be the nicest thing that you would either have, if you could not afford to have something newly made, or the nicest new thing that you would have made. You would wear it for your wedding day, it then became your new nicest garment. I can live a little bit in both worlds in that instance. I've actually worn, since the wedding in 2013, all of my wedding clothes in separate pieces multiple times. So I've gotten a lot of use out of it. A little bit of a modern aside, there's something to be said about having a historical wedding as a historical reenactor. So that's why it's a little bit on the snug side. It's been a few years. So this little garment, as I said, is called a Spencer jacket, and I wish I had been wearing it. Let me turn around to show you. Very popular garment for women in this time period as an outer garment. Sometimes even you would see these for an evening garment, they'd be without sleeves with a lower cut. Just a little something you could wear over a dress to change up a dress if you didn't have very many. It was a simple item that took a small amount of fabric to make it look like you had more clothes or new clothes. Because in this time, it is the opposite of how it is in 2015. In 1815, the materials cost the most and the labor cost less. In fact, the entirety of having a garment made, 10 to 12% of that was labor. The rest of it was materials. So you really were very careful about how you cut and things like that, which is very likely why Spencer's became such a popular garment. Took a little amount of fabric, and you could have more of them because it took so little. Mine is a white silk, so it's a very nice one. But if you notice when I was wearing it, all of the buttons that it had down the front. You remember when I mentioned earlier about fashion being the only way we could have a political statement? That was one of them. For English fashion specifically, which is what I represent mostly, if you think about it, England has been at war with some country or another for quite some time. We were battling Napoleon, and then we were battling America and Napoleon. So it was almost a way for women to go support the troops, would be to wear military-inspired clothing to provide a little bit of a visual support for all of the men that had to go and die in war. Another way that women could do it were painted fans. You could have political statements painted on them and display them. You could never really talk about it in mixed company or public, but you could show it. It was all right to show it. There were some extremes, of course, that were looked down upon. Some of the more blatant fans were probably talked about behind hands in public venues and assembly rooms, but it was one of the acceptable ways, as well as little brooches and cockades and things like that. So, oh, and something I will remove this, because we will be getting to that subject here shortly. There's some amusing stories about how this garment got its name. There's the tale that the Earl of Spencer stood too close to a fire and scorched the tails off of his coat because that garment started out as a men's garment. Spencer's were men's clothing before they were women's clothing. It was a short waist-length jacket you would wear over your tailcoat, which started out strong. France, of course, with the most garish of fashions, but it didn't last. However, women really enjoyed the idea, and they decided to wear them over their filmy dresses to keep themselves a little bit warmer. Very early in the epoch, women had very thin, filmy cotton dresses, and we don't start to see a bit of the heavier fabrics until we move forward. Of course, France was the leader in this, with their Monveuse and Incroyable fashions, where it was the thin dresses with nothing underneath. That's very extreme. That is not the usual and not the norm, nor is it the rule. It is the exception thereof, but it did exist. And the thin gowns permeated also into England and things like that. Great way to keep yourself warm. Another outer garment that would be just as helpful and appropriate to keeping oneself warm is the pelisse or the redingote, which are just long coats. They are two separate garments, but the lines become muddied. Really, it's just a long coat, and the word you see most in productions like Ackerman's Repository and La Belle L'Assemblée, which were your fashion magazines at the time, say pelisse. So we're going to go with pelisse, which is basically Spencer with skirts. Nice long warm coat you wear for dress. So, crossing over to the outer garments, underneath, of course, and this is how I would spend the rest of my day inside. Now, I could go out in this outfit. It is actually an appropriate cut and shape to be worn out of doors as a walking dress. In fact, it could even be considered a walking dress as it is. However, I need either my spencer or a shawl or a mantle, which is a short cloak, to go out. Otherwise, and my gloves, of course, and hat. But otherwise, I forgot I didn't have it on. It's so light. I wonder if I kept it on, and then I saw it on the table. You would need your going out accessories. A lot of dresses you see are considered a morning dress, M-O-R, not M-O-U. They need something to go on over top of it, so you're not going out in basically what would be considered your pajamas. Yes, there are modes of dress, ladies, that you would never be seen in. Your morning clothes, which, not maybe specifically this dress, though morning, this is where it gets confusing. Bear with me. A morning dress could be worn outside with the addition of some accessories, and sometimes would be called a walking dress with the accessories, but then sometimes there was also just a specific walking dress. You with me? You confused? It's alright, I get confused too. This is actually just a plain walking dress. It is made of wool. It is high in the neck, which is very popular for daytime, despite what a lot of people think. They think this time period is all décolletage and inappropriate. In 1815, the popular style is a high-necked gown with a lot of detail at the hem, which is what I have on. It's very thin, lightweight wool, and a very popular color. It wasn't all just the little white dress like we think. We see a lot of these Jane Austen adaptations. Say that 10 times fast. Jane Austen adaptations where all the heroines have little white dresses. And that sort of gets perpetuated, and while it was popular, yes, it was not the only option. And it was not the only thing worn. Colors were very popular, prints, solids, and not just cottons. Anytime you see, if you ever get a wild hair and want to look up any fashion magazines at the time, and you see something described as a cloth gown, it means wool. Otherwise, they're going to elaborate. A muslin gown, a silk gown, a sarcenet gown, percale gown, which is a kind of cotton, things like that. So cloth means wool. So this would be a cloth walking dress made high in the neck. This is how it would be described in a fashion magazine. Now this is where it's going to get a little tricky because, like an intelligent human being, I chose a high-necked gown that closes completely back, and I'm not a contortionist. So I may be calling upon the only other person in the room who knows how to get me in and out of these clothes. Nah, I need you.
Yeah, so.
Just to get the last one, please. By the way, this would be the point where I would tell the gentleman it's about to get completely inappropriate. Now would be the time to avert your gaze should you maintain any virtue, or if you are any sort of gentleman at all. As I see no one making any attempts, you three giggling. I'm just going to assume that you're all rakes and don't care about maintaining anyone's virtue. Oh, I don't have shoes at all, that's why it's so weird. So a very interesting note about this gown, I will mention. It was made specifically for the Battle of New Orleans, so specifically for 1815. And if anybody knows what the weather was doing in New Orleans at that time, it was not the pleasant, mild temperatures that everyone wanted it to be. We had a freak cold snap where the highs were in the 30s. So I really am very excited that this was a wool gown because this happened. Can those in the back see? There's a great hole burned in it. When it's all done and you want to come up and look, you can feel free to look, but try not to poke around the edges too much because it will crumble. Thank goodness it was wool. I did not go up like a Roman candle. It smoldered, I smelled burning, and went, oh, I wonder what that is. And went, oh, well, that's my dress because I stood too close to a wood stove. I was warm. This was the hem of my gown. Unfortunately, this is something that's I'm going to really have to show later because it's tone on tone. The trimming that I've done for this gown are 2 tucks. Let's see if I can get it here. 2 large tucks and a row of what's called Van Dyking. Van Dyke trim, or I've seen it as dog's teeth trim, dags, and things like that. I call them Van Dykes because it sounds much fancier. Something I also want to mention about this dress, I should actually say gown, going on the same subject there. In this time, and a little bit before it as well, there was an amusing trend that happened of trying to give garments very fancy names that didn't really need fancy names, because as somebody wanting to then figure out what they were meaning 200 years later, it has made it very difficult as a researcher to figure out what they're talking about, until I had the epiphany when I was in a store shopping for my modern self. This style of gown could be considered just simply a round gown because it is closed completely around. It's not open anywhere. By that meaning, it is not open in the front or showing anything off underneath. It is a round gown. However, you could see this gown described as anything from a French frock to a Grecian round gown, whatever and whatever, and some of the most elaborate, silly names you can think of, and really it's just a gown. You don't want to say dress in this period because the term dress is a mode. It is a mode of dress. It is not an item. It would be morning dress, evening dress, walking dress, things like that. It is not the garment, it is the whole ensemble. So it would be a gown or a frock. My modern excursion, I was in a store, I don't know if any of you have heard about this wild, crazy place called Forever 21, but I was there and was looking at some things. I passed a display that said leggings, and then I passed a display that said soft pant. And I went, what is the difference? They're essentially the same garment. And I realized, oh, some things have not changed. And then I thought about it more, and I thought, this boyfriend jean thing that is coming out. One store will call one shape the boyfriend jean. Another store will call another shape the boyfriend jean. Same concept. We're going to come up with a nice fancy name, but it's really just a jean. A soft pant is a legging, let's be honest. So it's, in the time period, I'm sure it was very frustrating and very confusing for a woman who was getting her fashion secondhand to try and keep up with all of that. Now, my crazy clown collar is not actually a crazy clown collar. I don't moonlight as any sort of circus performer. With a high-necked gown, it was very fashionable, especially in the teens, to have a great ruff, a very Elizabethan trend. Going to the Romantic era, which is what we are headed towards in 1815, it was very much romanticized, things like that. You see great big ruffs at the wrist and at the neck, either lace or muslin like this is. If the gown had been a little bit lower of a neck, or maybe a crossover, I would still fill in this extra space with something called a chemisette, which is really just a diminutive form of chemise, which is my last garment, also known as a shift, because it was only this big as opposed to this big, so chemisette. But since I had a high-necked gown, it's an extra piece I didn't need, so I just wore the ruff instead. These are very popular to see as a separate item